How does Jesus' high view of marriage actually protect and empower women instead of trap them? Does Paul agree or disagree with Jesus on his teachings? And when is a question not really a question? I'm St. K, and you're listening to the Foreign Saints podcast, keeping Christianity distinct in a world that insists on watering us down. All right, we are finally continuing with verse by verse teaching through the book of Matthew, picking up in chapter 19. We are going to be in verses 1 to 12 today. 1 to 12. All right. And I want to give a shout out to some new regions, to listeners in some new regions. Give a shout, give a praise to God. We got our first listeners in the Netherlands and in the UK, specifically in the Great Britain area. I just want to shout that out, not so much for me or, saying, oh, look at me and look at what I did, because I barely know what I'm doing outside of the exegeting, outside of just reading the Bible, right? Because all we do is read in these parts. But just, praise to God for the fact that good teaching is going out there. And also, many thanks to any of you guys that have listened or shared episodes, right? Because all the interaction that you do on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or whatever other platform you see this on tells the algorithm that this is stuff that needs to be pushed forward. People are willing to listen to this, and this is a message that is worth listening to. All right, the message that God sent his son to die for you, to give you new spiritual life, new life, period, eternal life in him. All right. And it's fitting that, we kind of start with that because, Easter just passed, Resurrection Day just passed. And, me and my wife, Meredith, we've been, you know, trying to start our own little, traditions or whatever, trying to have a tradition of having a lamb dinner and some green to go with it, kind of a play on the Passover meal of the Jews in the Old Testament, right? The lamb, the Passover lamb slain for them, and not just slain for them, but ingested by them, right? Because you're not just covered by the blood of Jesus, but you also take in Jesus, right? And so we kind of wanted to have that be a tradition that we do, and also, a nice, brilliantly done kale salad, kind of a play on the bitter herbs, right? And just kind of thinking as we're putting this meal together and eating it and doing all the usual things, with our two little boys, um, and just kind of thinking how, as I'm cutting this lamb up and, cutting the ribs and stuff like that, I'm just thinking, just in the back of my mind, I'm like, man, like Jesus really took this kind of pain for me. And as I'm eating this, this kale salad, I'm thinking in the back of my mind, I'm just reflecting on how the Jews, would eat bitter herbs to commemorate, their flight from Egypt. And it just made me consider how this world isn't really our home, how I can't get too wrapped up in the comforts and the creature comforts and the comfortability of this life and being an American and all that. But I need to be looking forward and having my life structured around the fact that there is a true home waiting for me, that there is a better country that awaits us in the Messiah. And I just wanted to share that meditation with you all, right? So let's go ahead and get into our text today. Like I said, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 19. So let me go ahead and cue up Logos so that you guys can see what I see. Matthew chapter 19. So let's go ahead and jump into it. You guys probably saw the title, nice and attention grabbing, isn't it? I'm going to make that case that, that God's stance on divorce, that the traditional Christian view of marriage, one man, one woman for life, no divorce, that is empowering to women. I'm going to make that case. All right. But there's a lot more to learn along the journey. All right. So hang on until then. You'll learn a lot. Here we go. Matthew 19, verses 1 to 3, 3a, I guess. Now, when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. And large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking. And we'll get into what they ask in a minute, but I wanted to kind of leave off their question for now, just so we could focus on the setting. All right. So Jesus had just finished a section of teaching, and that section of teaching being, the parable of the unforgiving servant and everything having to do with what you do if your brother sins against you, right? The church discipline flow chart. I know it's been a minute. Like I said, we finished the series of slavery in the gospel, and we finished the other series of transgenderism in the gospel. Both 4-part series. I put a lot of work into them, put a lot of prayer into them. Go check them out, or send them to somebody that you think could use the information and the encouragement there. But those were the things. That was the quick recap for this series, right? But see the setting here. Jesus is doing mass ministry again, as per usual, right? Healing those amongst the crowd, and most likely teaching as well, right? Because it's Jesus. That's kind of what he does, right? And in the middle of all that, some Pharisees arrive and interrupt proceedings, not to ask a question, right? And the question they ask about, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? That is a debate that's going on within Judaism at the time. And so you know, it makes sense that that would be a question that would be posed to Jesus by somebody eventually. But these guys are not coming to ask this question about this theological debate within Judaism. They want to use a theological debate within Judaism to test Jesus, to trap Jesus. All right? They're interrupting good ministry with an intellectually dishonest line of questioning. And let me be clear, the question that they ask is a good one. But because they view the question as a weapon to test Jesus, they specifically will never benefit from the answer. Oh, there you are, little guy. You're a big guy? Nice.
Good night.
Good night, Dad.
Good night, son. Good night, Zim.
Good night.
Night.
Come on, buddy.
Close the door, Mari.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh man, gotta love that. Gotta love that, right? Let's see here. Let's see, where was I? Yeah, as I was saying, they're never gonna benefit from the answer to that question, right? Because they don't actually care about the answer to the question. They see the question as, as a convenient weapon. They see the question as a tool of utility against this man that they've already predeterminately set themselves against, right? And so, even though the question is a good one, I mean, this is a very good question, but the answer is going to be wasted on people with their mindset. And I bring this up because the same is true for those in the modern day that see questions as weapons to test Jesus, to test Christianity, and to test the church. You're not going to get the benefit of the answers to questions when you view questions as weapons. All right, you're just not. All right, let me show you something out of the wisdom literature here. Let me use this tab. In the book of Proverbs, whoa, I need this whole thing going. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 21, verse 24, we get this definition of a scoffer. Scoffer is the name of the arrogant, haughty man who acts with arrogant pride. All right, now why is that important? Because of something that Proverbs says in an earlier chapter. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 6, it says this: a scoffer, the kind of person that was, that we just got that definition for, a scoffer seeks wisdom in vain. In vain. All right? A scoffer, a haughty, arrogant person that acts with pride in their spirituality will seek wisdom uselessly. They're never going to find the thing that they claim to be seeking. But on the other hand, knowledge is easy for a man of understanding, okay? Arrogant, haughty men that act with arrogant pride seek wisdom in vain. Knowledge is not easy for them. And it's not for intellectual reasons. It's not because they're dumb. They're actually quite intelligent, right? And it's not like their intelligence in and of itself is bad either. It's got nothing to do with the intellect. The answers that Jesus gives are not typically that difficult to explain. Some things are, but for the most part, the bread and butter stuff, the one-on-ones, those things are typically not that difficult, in my estimation. But even the fundamentals of the faith are a struggle for people who have a prideful desire to expose Christianity instead of serve Jesus. Right? When the whole reason you're asking a question is because you're trying to disprove something, you're never going to find out what's true. Like you're never going to hear anything good that might be in it. You're never going to get to the core because you have an answer that you've already decided upon. You're just trying to chart a course to get there. All right. And I can't help but also think of Proverbs 14:9, just a few verses down. Fools mock at the guilt offering, but the upright enjoy acceptance. You could also say in the Hebrew, but among the upright is acceptance. All right. Jesus is the ultimate guilt offering, and fools will mock at him. But those that are wise and upright have already enjoyed accepting this offering of Jesus and who he is. All right. These Pharisees that we see in Matthew 19, these Pharisees and other moderns that mock at the guilt offering of Jesus, given on their behalf, will take questions that are intrinsically good. The questions themselves are fine and good and even necessary, but they will try to weaponize them against the believer. All right. This is why topics and questions can be like a merry-go-round with some people. And some of you people listening, some of you Christians listening, know exactly what I'm talking about through experience. Some people will ask a question, receive a good answer, and then move on and ask the next question and ask the next Christian down the line the same questions with the same level of arrogant smugness. They never cared about the answer. They just wanted to play a game of stump the Christian, and they couldn't beat you. So they tossed your pearls of wisdom in the trash and looked for another less knowledgeable Christian to bully. It'll feel like you're talking with a brick wall. You'll give good, reasonable, scripturally sound answers to otherwise good questions and be met with more mockery, not engagement. Even if the engagement is disagreement, that's one thing. But to meet a good answer with mockery is wild to me. The weight of the scoffing on its own can make you feel dumb, but scoffing is just hot air. Don't worry about the scoffing of fools and trolls. Just pray for them from a distance. Just pray for them from a distance. All right. So getting into verse 3b, and for those that don't know what I mean by 3a and b, 3a is the first half of verse, b, the second half of the verse. And sometimes you'll see A, B, or C for particularly long verses. And, A is the first third, B is the second third, C is the third. But yeah, let's get into their question. Let's start working through this for understanding. Their question: is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? For any cause. All right, that's really the thing that's up for debate, right? Not so much is it lawful to divorce one's wife. Everyone kind of agreed that it's obvious that it is lawful, but for any cause. Are there restrictions on when you can get a divorce? On when a man or woman can divorce their spouse? Are there restrictions on that? Or is that just kind of open season to anyone? And the reason they ask this is because of Deuteronomy 24 verse 1. This is the passage that's kind of in their minds. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand, and yada yada yada. We'll get into it, but basically the debate was about what did indecency mean. All right, other translations will put the word uncleanness here, right? Because he's found some uncleanness in her, right? But the Hebrew word, same word, right? Erva, all right? For nakedness, shame, indecency, all right? And so there were two different Jewish schools of thought on this matter. Two big ones anyway, and their opinions are, in my estimation, literally no different to today. You've got on one side of the ring, let me dramatize this a little bit because I like to have a little bit of fun. On one side of the ring, you've got Rabbi Shammai's school of thought, who specifically wants to stick to what the Hebrew actually says. They are Jews, after all. Let's stick to what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew says erva, and the definition for that is nakedness, shame, or indecency. So the Shammai school of thought would interpret this verse, this uncleanness, as some kind of sexual immorality. In other words, right, you can divorce your wife if you find some sexual infidelity amongst her, right? If she's not been faithful to you, that is grounds that allows you to divorce, right? But in the other corner, we've got Rabbi Hillel's school of thought. And then this guy, Rabbi Hillel, he likes to be a bit more liberal with his interpretations, it seems. Uncleanness, according to Hillel, was defined in the mind of the husband, aka whatever the husband took to be an indecency or an uncleanness, aka you're able to divorce for literally any reason that you want. Obviously, that's going to be the more popular view. You know what I mean? And our culture, oh man, our culture is like Hillel, I think, on steroids, right? Anyone can get divorced for any reason. And in my experience in life, short though it is, I tend to hear divorce, when marital problems are brought up, especially amongst the world. I tend to hear divorce encouraged quicker and faster than I do sticking it out and working it out, right? So obviously, Rabbi Hillel's interpretation was probably more popular amongst majority, and Rabbi Shammai's interpretation is going to be probably more welcome amongst those that all they want to do is read, and they just want to stick to what the text actually says and be honest with words on a page and not redefine clear Hebrew. Because remember, they spoke this. You know what I mean? And not redefine very clear words, to do whatever the heck that they want to do. But that's the question that they posed to Jesus. And it just seems odd that Pharisees would put this question to Jesus. After all, Pharisees, who, are more inclined naturally to lean towards Rabbi Shammai's school of thought on the whole, since Pharisees on the whole tend to be the ones that are a bit more um, you know, when compared with their Sadducean brothers, at least, they tend to be a little bit more honest with the text. They both hate Jesus, but, a Pharisee will sooner look at words on a page and say, well, this is what the words mean. And as we all know, right, because the Pharisees' problem was taking things too far, right? Taking the definitions of words and being too wooden with them, all right? Their problem is never going to be Rabbi Hillel's school of thought. But let's talk tactics, right? And again, all this stuff is important. Before we can even understand this conversation, you got to understand the context of it, right? Because this question, though it is a good one. Right, let me come back to Matthew. The question they ask is a good one. And, if someone, were to show up in my comment section or something or email me at the Foreign Saints Podcast at gmail.com, if someone were to do that, and they were to ask this question, my first reaction would be, oh, this is a perfectly fair question. Let me deal with it straight up in an honest way. But the Pharisees, they've got a track record by the 19th chapter of this point of never asking anything honestly, right? They don't care what Jesus' answer will be. They hate him already. All right? They're already thinking about murdering him, and they're gonna commit to it later on, right? They don't care what Jesus has to say. They weren't gonna listen to him really anyway. So why are they asking this question, right? Because there's a trap here, right? There's a trap here. And then this is part of what Jesus means. I don't know if I think it's something we'll get to soon or later. When Jesus tells his people, be wise as serpents but harmless as doves. This is part of having conversations with people in a fallen world, man, about Jesus. Like sometimes good questions don't have good intentions, right? That's why we got to make it natural to walk in the supernatural, so that way, God willing, we can sniff this stuff out as it comes. But here's the trap. If Jesus sides with Shammai, then what they would most likely do, I think what they would most likely do is co-opt Jesus against their personal theological enemies and opposition, making Jesus a prop in their political games. Why do I say that? Because we have an example of the Pharisees doing this exact thing with the Apostle Paul relatively soon after Jesus' ascension. Here in Acts 23, verses 1 to 10, Paul is on trial before the entirety of the Sanhedrin, right? Pharisees and Sadducees together in one room to come against this guy, Paul, right? They've already punched him. They've already, at this point, and so Paul, is trying to find a way out of this. How do I get myself out of this sticky situation while not compromising the message of Jesus? Look here at verse 6. Now, when Paul perceived, right, he's observing, right, he's in a sticky situation, he's got his eyes open, right? When Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, right? So Paul's sitting in the chamber, he's looking out across the crowd. Remember, Paul's a Pharisee, he knows some of these people, probably did ministry with some of these people. And looks out in the crowd and he says, oh man, they're presenting as one group, but we got half Sadducee, half Pharisee up in here. Paul is going to use their divisive nature against them. He cries out in the council, brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope in the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial, which is true. Paul very cleverly couched faith in Jesus in a way that the Pharisees would agree with. When he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply, we find nothing wrong in this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him? And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring them into the barracks. Hey man, I just got to say, bro, well played, very well played, Paul, very well played. Bit of a risky maneuver, right? Because to get out of there, you kind of needed this to get a little bit violent, so the Tribune would pull you out of there. But Paul knew. Paul knew. As much as they hate me, these guys are extremely tribal. Sound like any culture you know of today? Nudge, nudge, hint, hint, American listeners, right? Because of how fractured and tribal they are, they can't even really be unified in their unity against me, right? As much as they want to fight against God, they can't actually work together well enough to even do that. And I can use that. Says Paul, right? But I mean, same Pharisees is coming against Jesus, same group of people. So if they would try to co-opt Paul, I feel pretty confident that they would have tried to co-opt Jesus if they could have, right? So that's what happens if Jesus goes down the Shammai route. If Jesus sides with Hillel, well, that's even easier. Then you just paint Jesus as an enemy of the Torah, and then you co-opt Jesus anyway but as a symbol of the apostasy of the other side, as a symbol of the apostasy of the Sadducees that are, all sorts of highfalutin, rich and very comfortable and don't really understand the struggle of the common Jew, right? So basically, what's happening here is the Pharisees think that they've put Jesus in such a theological quandary that whatever answer he gives, they have the upper hand. And the any avid listener of this show should notice something quite quickly and say to themselves, the obvious way out of this trap is to just open up the Torah, right? And read it and ground your view there instead of in one of these rabbis, right? And that's exactly what Jesus does. But you might say to yourself, how did they miss such an obvious escape hatch? How did they miss the fact that if Jesus simply ignores the Shammai Hillel debate and just answers with, well, when I look at the Torah, I read this, and then say whatever view you have, right? That's the easiest way out of it. So why didn't they see that? Well, oftentimes the Torah is read and understood, and this is true even still to this day, that the Torah is read and understood through the lens of the rabbis to such a degree that the ones with actual authority become the rabbis instead of the text itself, right? That's why in Judaism today, you have this thing called rabbinic Judaism, and it's a real thing, right? Because there's the Judaism of the prophets, there's the Judaism of Moses and the prophets, and then you've got the Judaism of more modern rabbis after, a couple centuries after the destruction of the temple. Because when you read the Old Testament, it's quite clear that there is no Judaism without a functioning temple, right? So much of what makes Judaism is anchored in having a functioning temple, is anchored in having a traceable Aaronic priesthood to be the Levitical priests that run the temple, right? Um, Much to do about sacrifices and offerings and all this other stuff. And God makes clear plenty of times in the Torah that if you don't like you can't, I'm not accepting sacrifices given anywhere other than this temple, right? Which is why Daniel, and this one's for free. This one's not even in my notes. I'm just kind of off the top of my head right now, but it's worth mentioning. That's why Daniel in chapter 9, um, that's why Daniel in chapter 9 will say, let's see here, verse 11, all Israel has transgressed your law and turned aside, refusing to obey your voice. And the curse and oath that are written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, have been poured out upon us because we have sinned against him. Right? They don't have a temple in Daniel's day because they're under Babylonian captivity, right? And so what does Daniel say? Since they don't have a temple, right? Does he try to make atonement with his own good deeds, as Rabbinic Judaism will teach? Will he try to make atonement through his prayer life, as Rabbinic Judaism will teach sometimes? No, he does something very different. Verse 17, now therefore, O our God, listen to the prayer of your servant and to his pleas for mercy. And for your own sake, O Lord, make your face to shine upon your sanctuary, which is desolate. Oh my God, incline your ear and hear, open your eyes and see our desolations in the city that is called by your name. For we do not present our pleas before you because of our righteousness, but because of your great mercy. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, pay attention and act. Because of your righteousness, not because of our righteousness. For your sake, says Daniel, forgive us, even though we don't have what it takes. Right? And I've heard a lot of modern rabbinic Jews literally like straight up disagree with Daniel on this. They think they're agreeing with Daniel, but they're disagreeing with him, right? I've heard some modern rabbinic Jews say with a kind of familial pride that they are the theological descendants of the Pharisees from Jesus' day. Not my words, their words. And they will have the exact same disagreements that those Pharisees had. Not every Jew, but some Jews, right? Minority of Jews are like this. And because of this rabbinical supremacy over the text, the Pharisees thought that they had Jesus trapped because they have a way to weaponize him no matter which rabbinical school of thought he sides with. But Jesus avoids that trap by saying, all you got to do is read. And Christians today, especially Catholic or East Orthodox or any Christian that has a passion or an interest for church history, which includes me, by the way, I do have a passion in that, we can run into the same problem where we replace, and instead of looking at scripture alone, we do like the Jews, but instead of basing our authority on rabbis, we base our authority on church fathers, where we read scripture through the lens of our favorite and usually cherry-picked church leaders, usually cherry-picked quotes from church leaders, right? We're not always reading the entirety of what a church leader had to say on a topic. We just read the bits that we like, right? We read scripture through the lens of our favorite, usually cherry-picked church leaders from the past, instead of reviewing even the earliest of them according to the text, right? Rabbi Calvin or Rabbi Arminius? Rabbi Luther or Zwingli, or the rabbis at the Council of Trent? Ignatius or Polycarp, right? Well, Augustine said. Well, here's my question, folks. What about what Jesus or the apostles said? Not Calvin, not Arminius, Luther, Zwingli, the Council of Trent, Ignatius, Polycarp, or Augustine. Only follow them inasmuch as they follow Jesus. Only follow them inasmuch as they follow Jesus, as the Apostle Paul said. Right? Follow me as I follow Christ, not follow me without qualification. Right? But let's keep going. Verses 4-6. How does Jesus actually deal with what they say, with what they ask? He answered, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. And right here, we have what I would call the ideal. All right. Jesus quoting from Genesis chapters 1 and 2 together, right? In the beginning, he made them male and female, right? The making of men and women in the image of God as male and female. That is in chapter 1 of Genesis, chapter verse 26 specifically, I believe. Like I said, I know our culture takes issue with that. Like I said, I got a 4-part series, Transgenderism and the Gospel. Go listen to that. All right. I actually do talk about this chapter in like episode 4, I think. I don't even remember at this point. I don't know. It's in the episode descriptions, but go look at it. I'm not dealing with an apologetic defense against transgenderism here. Got a whole series for that. So that's why I'm leaving those bits out of of this, right? But yeah, the making of the male and female is in chapter 1, but the statement about a man leaving his father and mother and holding fast to his wife and that one flesh union, that is in Genesis chapter 2, right? He quotes 1 and 2 to establish marriage as one man, one woman for life as the foundation of their own family, separate and unique from the two families that they came from, right? So, in Jesus' point, when he says, what therefore God has joined together, let not man separate, his point is that allowing divorce for any reason the smallest issue or inconvenience undermines the whole point of the covenant, right? I have seen, the usual, stereotype of, oh, she burnt the toast. So, she burnt the toast. So, I guess she's got to go. Not much of a stereotype, actually. Let me see if I can find it real quick. I'm going to do a jump cut. All right, so right here on the screen, I've got the Talmud, the William Davidson Talmud, as you can see up on the screen. And so the Talmud, it's not like a commentary today. Like commentaries give you the opinion of multiple people on a passage of scripture, right? The Talmud is more like a record of debates, records of rabbinic debates about topics, right? Sort of like present to you a whole bunch of different views, and then like you, the reader, kind of, you know, take what you can from them, kind of. So I mean, even that description is selling the Talmud far short of what it is. But for this section of the Talmud that we're looking at, it's enough. And so what we see here, right? You've got you've got Shammai, our guy, that says a man may not divorce his wife unless he finds out about her having engaged in a manner of forbidden sexual intercourse. She committed adultery or is suspected of doing so. I wouldn't quite agree with that. Number's 5. As it is stated, because he has found some unseemly matter in her. Ervat Devar. And he writes her a scroll of severance, right? So you see, Shammai is trying to stick with the words written on the page. Like I said, even then, I don't fully agree with him, but that's another thing. But you see, he's at least sticking to the actual Hebrew, right? But then you get Hillel, who says the following: he may divorce her even due to a minor issue, because she burned or oversalted his dish, as it is stated, because he has found some unseemly matter in her, meaning that he found any type of shortcoming in her. And then you've got another guy, Rabbi Akiva, who says he may divorce her even if he found another woman who is better looking than her and wishes to marry her, as it is stated in that verse, and it comes to pass if she finds no favor in his eyes, right? You got 3 different really smart, really intelligent Jewish rabbis looking at the same verse, Deuteronomy 24:1, and at least 2 of them are wildly off the mark, according to what Jesus tells us, right? He doesn't even he looks at Deuteronomy 24, Jesus does, and he grounds it in Genesis, something that Shammai, Hillel, and Akiva apparently all fail to do here, in this part. Maybe they do later on in the Talmud. It's not like we got the Talmud, memorized or anything like that, right? But you see how Jesus handled the text way differently. He's looking at intent, right? Because they ask him a question: is it lawful to do this? So they're limiting their question technically to just, what does the law of Moses allow for, right? But Jesus is getting at something even deeper than that. What does God desire? Which again says so much, that there are some things in the law of Moses that might not necessarily reflect God's definition of the ideal. And people can take that and run with it way too far. Again, I talked about that both in transgenderism and the gospel, and in slavery and the gospel. This comment by Jesus, actually, it does so much for how you look at the law of Moses. Right? But you see what I mean, right? Like very few people even today would agree with, a Hillel or an Akiva, right? Really? Really? Man can divorce his wife because he found someone prettier? Really? Man can divorce his wife because she burnt the toast? Like like that's an like you really think the God of Genesis would have been okay with that? Really? And you think that's an intellectually honest position? I mean, all right. If that's where you want, if that's where you want to be, praise Jesus for the fact that he came down and straightened some of these things out. Um, but I remember I was at work, right, and I had a coworker of mine, older lady, married, has adult children that are moved out, got their own families, that sort of thing. She asked me if I felt that her son and his wife were kind of disrespecting her, or, maybe not disrespecting, but just kind of disregarding her by not prioritizing calling or texting or, showing up for certain things or whatever. Um, and so, I asked some questions because I don't want to give my opinion on something I'm not really part of, to be honest, but I didn't want to just ignore her either. So I was like, well, tell me a little bit about what's going on. And she let me know that all this was going on during a season when, her son and his wife had just had a new baby, and that baby needed to stay in the NICU for a bit. And she also, he did call and stuff, but not as fast and not as much as she desired, it seemed. And this woman was a Christian, which made having this conversation a little bit easier because I could just easily appeal to what Jesus said, but and to Genesis. But I suggested to her that maybe she was overestimating where she ranked in her son's priority list. Now that he has a wife and a kid, right? Like, his priority list goes in this order: God first, wife second, child and children third, family outside of the household. So at best, I'm like, you take the number 4 spot in his list of God ordained priorities, right? The one flesh union that is marriage reprioritizes everything in the life of husband and wife, and everyone else in their orbit either needs to get with that program or get used to living frustrated. Get used to living frustrated, as their marriage is a constant reminder that you're not the center of their universe. Is a constant reminder that your children don't actually exist for you, but exist for God, right? Jesus's point is that in light of the ideal that's revealed in Genesis, we can say no. Divorce is not something that God desires. Like I said, not the same thing as unlawful. Not the same thing as unlawful, right? Because that's Jesus' point, right? A man leaves his father and his mother, right? Why would God desire divorce when marriage requires a man and the woman leaving their respective families to start a new one? Why would God ordain it to work like that if he was okay with just casually shattering that? That don't even make sense, right? Okay, fine. But then that invites the follow up question, the very natural follow up question, which is not a bad question, by the way. But again, the Pharisees don't care for what the answer is, right? But their question is a good one. If that's true, Jesus, well, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? All right, now they definitely think they got him. If God never desired divorce, then why would God command divorce in the law? And here's a corollary to that. Why would God codify things into the law of Moses that he doesn't really desire when he's God and can do anything that he wants to do literally, right? And this is the answer that Jesus gives, specifically concerning divorce, but I think it applies to much more than that. Jesus' answer: because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. So, in short, it's because the ideal is not always obtainable in this fallen world, because specifically of hardness of heart. And what is hardness of heart? Short answer, stubbornness. Short answer. It's a little bit deeper than that, though, right? But again, look back at an earlier message, right? What was it on? What was it on hardened hearts and softening clay? Something like that. Where I do a bit of a deeper dive into this concept of hardness of heart, right? But here's the thing: because humans are stubborn for sinful reasons or whatever, we're not always desirous of God's ideal. We're not always pursuing God's ideal. So, God prevents the worst case scenarios from occurring by putting regulations on divorce, something he doesn't like and doesn't desire, and never commands either. God never commands divorce in the law of Moses, right? The section of Deuteronomy that they're talking about, look at it. Look at it. This section of Deuteronomy, you're never going to find a command to have a divorce in this situation, right? Let's look at the first 3 verses of Deuteronomy 24. When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then, so when this thing happens, a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, she cheated at some point in the past, he finds out about it. And he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. That's not a command. That's just a description of something happening. And she departs out of his house. And if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her and writes her a certificate of divorce, also not a command, just a description of a hypothetical scenario, and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. Or if the latter man dies, who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away, here's the command, may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. That's the command. That's the command, right? The first 3 verses are describing a specific undesirable scenario, right? Emphasis on undesirable scenario, by the way. A man who marries a woman, that woman cheats on him sexually, and he finds out about it at some point down the road. Because of that, the man's heart is hardened against her, right? She finds no favor in his eyes, right? She finds no favor in his eyes. And the man's heart is hardened against her. He then writes a divorce certificate. She leaves and marries a second man, but that marriage also doesn't work out, or he dies. But that's a very undesirable scenario that not everyone is going to fall into. None of that is a command. All of that is just set up for the actual command. In this very specific scenario, this is what you aren't allowed to do. It's what you're not allowed to do. And I'm curious about something. Hang on, folks. Another jump cut incoming. Yep, that's exactly what I suspected. Exactly what I suspected. In Deuteronomy 24:1, when it talks about a man, not finding favor, when it talks about the wife not finding favor in the man's eyes, right? The woman who cheated on her husband not finding favor in the eyes of the husband. That word for favor, I had a sneaking suspicion because of a study I did in Genesis 6 for something else, that word favor was grace. So I looked it up. Favor in the Hebrew, chen, right? You get into it, or kane, or however you say it. Ken, I think. But the definition is grace, favor, charm, right? Graciousness. Often translated as grace in the New Testament, reflecting a similar concept of unmerited favor. In other words, right? Like literally, if the man's heart is so hardened against his wife that he cannot find it within him to forgive her, then that's the exact scenario here, right? And that's exactly what Jesus is even talking about in Matthew when he says, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. From the beginning, it was not so. Even in cases of sexual infidelity, God desires grace to revive the relationship. But because he understands the frailness and the weakness of humanity, and because he also understands just how deep a hurt that is, though God desires reconciliation, when people don't pursue it and instead go the route of divorce in that scenario of sexual infidelity, God won't hold it against you. God doesn't hold it against you. And that is a very big deal. That is a very big deal. All right, but back to what I was saying about the scenario in Deuteronomy 24 being a very specific one. What we have here is what I would call an example of case law. All right, what is case law? Commands that are specific to a context, but not to be applied beyond or outside of that context, right? Well, what is the purpose of case law? Why have something like that? So that where and when the ideal has been lost, where and when the ideal is unretrievable, case law prevents the worst case scenarios from materializing. And so, what would be some worst case scenarios from, a woman cheating on her husband and the man not finding it in his heart to forgive her, even if she was repentant? Because obviously, you can't forgive someone who's not sorry for what they did. But even in the case where they were sorry for what they did and he just couldn't find it within himself to forgive her, what would be some worst case scenarios that might materialize from that? Just some things that I can think of off the top of my head. The complete emptying of all value from marriage as a concept societally. That's a pretty bad one. In American culture, we're kind of seeing the fruits of that play out. People not valuing marriage, people not having kids, populations not able to properly replace themselves, right? Western countries having to truck in immigrants legally or otherwise to offset some of that. That's problematic. Um, Funnily enough, trying to bring in immigrants that probably value marriage more than that Western society does, because every society needs some amount of people that actually value marriage and building a family for that society to continue. Secondly, the second worst case scenario, treating marriage as a form of prostitution by divorcing for a couple days to have sex with another and then remarrying after the weekend, as happens in many Islamic countries, right? Like, why else have this command that, if she divorces husband number one, marries husband number two, and that doesn't work out, you can't go back to husband number one? It was a very common practice in the Middle East. Still is a pretty common practice now. I can only imagine how common it was back in the day. You can loan your wife out legally by going through short-term divorces. Like I said, that reduces marriage to essentially prostitution at that point. We also know from our own sociological studies here in the modern day that second marriages, subsequent marriages, have higher failure rates than the first marriages, right? So you've got this restriction here that, she can't go back to the first husband. Why? Um, to give a greater incentive to that second marriage to work it out and last, right? And the obvious one that comes to mind in this specific scenario, by allowing divorce at all, it gives opportunity for the woman who, in this hypothetical scenario, is guilty of adultery, by the way, right? Not an innocent or good woman, hypothetically speaking here. She cheated on her husband and hid it from him, right? Um, But by allowing divorce, it allows that guilty woman from potentially being subject to retaliatory violence or abuse on the part of the man who was hurt emotionally, right? Just because you did this thing doesn't mean that the man gets to take justice in his own hands, doesn't mean that the husband gets to gets to take his revenge out on her, right? God desires reconciliation. Even in the case of sexual infidelity, he desires reconciliation. But if that is unachievable, God would prefer the marriage be dissolved than for a marriage to turn into a prison of increasing sin and abuse. And this isn't the only, case law thing that God has in place to fight for the marriages of his people, right? Numbers chapter 5, right? The Lord spoke to Moses saying, "Speak to the people of Israel. If any man's wife goes astray and breaks faith with him, if a man lies with her sexually and it's hidden from the eyes of her husband, and she is undetected, though she has defiled herself, and there is no witness against her, since she was not taken in the act." And so that's one undesirable scenario, right? Here's another undesirable scenario. If the spirit of jealousy overcomes him, and he is jealous of his wife who has defiled herself. Or if the spirit of jealousy comes over him and he's jealous of his wife, though the wife actually has been faithful, then the rest of this stuff in Numbers 5 that happens, right? Ideally, you don't even want to have to activate Numbers 5. Because if Numbers 5 has to be activated, it means that there's either secret infidelity that needs to be exposed, or you have a faithful wife that for some reason is being looked at suspiciously by her husband. And back then in the ancient days, if the wife was faithful but the husband had doubts about that, it didn't always end too well. Right? So we're seeing all these things in the law that God has put in place to limit the potential retaliatory abuse, the potential chauvinistic, negative patriarchal kinds of abuse, that women guilty of adultery and women innocent of adultery but suspected of adultery have faced, throughout history. He's baked these things into the law because he knows how stubborn and hard of heart we can be in our fallen state. Right? Again, I know it might sound a bit repetitive, but I want this to get drilled into your noggin that divorce was allowed because human hearts can be hard to the point of not pursuing God's ideal. On two sides, right? You've got the hardness of heart in the offender, obviously. The spouse, I said this before, that the spouse that cheated may be hard-hearted to such a degree that they have no desire to repent to God about their adultery. They have no desire to repent to the spouse that they cheated on, right? And if the spouse that cheated never repents to their partner, there is no hope for reconciliation there, because you can't reconcile when no one's acknowledging their guilt in a situation. So that's one hardness of heart. But then you've got the hardness of heart in the one sinned against, which I've also talked about. Just doing a review so we can move forward. The innocent spouse definitely has potential to have a heart that's hardened, even to a repentant cheating spouse. Keyword repentant, right? I can very easily see a scenario where, man or woman, right? They're married, one of those two cheats on the other, they're convicted about it though, their conscience is bothered. They come to them tearful, broken, repentant. I'm sorry. I don't know how I could possibly do this thing, and all this other stuff, but it was entirely on my fault. You're not to blame. It was I'm owning that. I can totally, but could you forgive me, please? Let me work this out. I can totally see someone being in that scenario and the innocent spouse being so hard of heart because of the magnitude of the offense, that the only barrier to grace becomes the innocent spouse, right? God desires reconciliation, but God, even in the new covenant, will allow that innocent spouse to divorce in that situation if their heart is truly that hardened. As I said, I think this speaks to the trauma of soul that unfaithfulness in a marriage causes, that Jesus allows this route under new covenant regulations at all. But it also means that we can't weaponize forgiveness because God doesn't, right? God, the most merciful, God, the one who desires reconciliation, even in the worst cases of marital breakdown, he's not going to hold the believer, he's not going to hold the innocent believer to that, right? I think there's a gigantic blessing in there if you do. I think there's a gigantic testimony in that, right? But there's no sin that's credited to your account, right? Just based on what Jesus taught, right? He said earlier in Matthew 5, right? Don't divorce except for sexual immorality. That's allowed. I'd like you to work it out, but it's allowable if you don't. God's like, I get it. I get it. That's a high magnitude offense, right? But man, doesn't what Jesus say there just kind of break your heart there, you know, at the end? From the beginning it was not so. It's like, man, it's like not that the creator gets tired, but it's like, the exasperation in the voice of the creator. From the beginning it was not so, you know? Back when things weren't broken, when rhythm and shalom were intact, it wasn't like this. Adam and Eve were not created to divorce, nor was any man or woman, but the ideal is not always achievable in this age. Exhibit number 2,000,000 for why we need Jesus to save us and show us his way. As it says in Luke chapter 1, Jesus is the sunrise of God who shines to give us light and guide us into the way of peace, because on our own, we don't know it. On our own, we don't know it. In verse 9, very clear, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. Jesus is clear that marrying another person after a frivolous divorce is recognized as adultery because you wrongly left your spouse and tried to dress it up in modern language, right? God's not leading you into that, right? You're talking about divorcing your spouse and there's no sexual immorality to speak of in the situation. It's for stupid stuff like, oh, they burnt the toast. Oh, they leave the toilet seat up or down or whatever. You know, little things. I just fell out of love with him. It just didn't work. So sometimes people are better friends than married. Stuff. The stuff that we say, the stupid stuff that we say. God's not leading you into that. You're just deceiving yourself in your disillusionment with the flaws in your current spouse and your rose-tinted glasses for what you think you could have elsewhere. Like I said, bro, I've seen people ruin good things over this, bro. Made episodes about it, man. Man, the sin of covetousness, man. That sin that kills you soft and slow. That's the title you got to look for if you want that story. All right, but let's move on to verses 10 through 12, where we see another tragedy. The disciples are broken and busted up too. The disciples said to him, "If such is the case of a man with his wife, it's better not to marry." Jesus' reply, "Not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who's able to receive this, receive it." All right? The, the disciples saying this shows to me, low-key, that they agree more with the Pharisees than Jesus. They agree more with a Rabbi Hillel and a Rabbi Akiva than they do Jesus, which is tough, man. The creator of the world, the creator of each of these men, standing in the midst of a train wreck right now. No one in this scene, not the Pharisees, not the disciples, truly understand the heart of the Father, Son, and Spirit concerning marriage. None of them understand the picture yet. And even worse, they resist the true beauty of what God ordained. The disciples seem to be saying that if a man is truly locked into marriage the way Jesus says, they think it'd be better for a man to never do it. My dude, implications abound for what's going on in their head, right? It seems to imply that they also believe in a sinful, twisted view of masculinity. They think that faithfulness in marriage is somehow a subtraction to manhood instead of a fulfillment, just like many in our culture today think that. Um, you know, might seem to imply that they're seeing marriage as a chain to be dodged, as a trap to avoid, instead of a blessing, right? That at least the idea of the potential for sexual freedom was something they valued about being a man, which, as a man, of course, that's something that your flesh values. But that part of you's got to die, man. And lastly, it might also seem to imply that the idea of a husband serving his wife and sacrificing for her rubbed them the wrong way, right? Which, of course, it did. Jesus says in another place in Mark chapter 10, let me just go ahead and pull it up, right? In Mark chapter 10, here towards the end, we see Jesus say to his disciples, let me see if I can actually find it here. Yeah, we see Jesus say to his disciples, those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. The great ones exercise authority, but it shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great among you must be your servant. Whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. Even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Applying that ethic into the realm of marriage, not something they want to do, right? Who's considered the ruler in a marriage? Well, the husband, right? But according to Jesus, if you want to be great in your leadership, if you want to be in your leadership, you got to be a servant to those under you. That means that the husband, to be a great husband, you have to be a servant to that woman who's under you. You got to find a way to be her slave. You got to find a way to give your life to serve that woman. Right? That's what that means. That's what that means, right? And we'll more on that. More on that soon. More on that soon, right? But the Roman culture, like the Roman culture that surrounded them, they had a cultural disregard for marriage that I hypothesize, may be infecting their thinking as well. Because the Romans certainly held to a much more extreme version of this thought process that allowed for Roman men to have a high degree of sexual freedom while women had higher expectations of chastity and sexual faithfulness assumed of them, right? Let me show you this article from Michael J. Kruger from Cannon Fodder. Man, that's a good name, by the way. Man, that should have been the name of the show. Goodness. How early Christianity was mocked for welcoming women. And yes, it was, man. Like the modern day narrative that Christianity was just anti-women is nuts. Absolutely nuts. The author writes, I recently received a question on Twitter about where in our patristic sources we see early Christianity mocked for being a religion filled with women. The short answer is lots of places. Lots of places, right? But something I want you to see, all right? Early Christianity received that criticism because it was so popular with women during that time period. Not what people think about Christianity today. There's this myth floating around that, the Christian religion was just written by a bunch of, light skinned, gray haired dudes that just wanted to control women. When, no, that's not the case, right? Um, Sociologist Rodney Stark estimates that perhaps 2/3 of the Christian community during the 2nd century was made up of women, the exact opposite ratio in the broader Greco Roman world, where women only made up about 1/3 of the population, right? So Christianity in the 2nd century was a disproportionately female religion. Now, why would that be the case if everything that Christianity taught was so anti-woman? Why would they do that, right? These are women in a Greco-Roman context. They know what anti-female patriarchy looks like. Why would they be attracted to a second helping? Why? As the author says, women intentionally were leaving the religious systems of the Greco-Roman world and consciously deciding to join the burgeoning Christian movement. No one forced them. No one made them to become Christians, right? And Christianity wasn't very popular. Widely despised, viewed with suspicion and scorn, regarded as a threat to a stable society, right? And all that is what, according to the author, sets the stage for the critics of early Christianity, right? If they were looking for a way to undermine this new religious movement, and they were, then the involvement of women is an easy target. Why? Because it was standard fare in the Greco Roman world to attack religions with women. They did it all the time. There was an ideal of masculinity for the Romans that such religions just didn't meet. Just didn't meet. Right? So they became the targets of ridicule. And that, again, should not be a surprise. Our culture agrees with this kind of sentiment as well. Men in particular have a tendency to see Christianity as emasculating. because Jesus has a different definition of strength and greatness than our cultural systems teach us and socialize us into. Instead of survival of the fittest, Jesus says offering of the fittest. I'm the fittest, says Jesus. All y'all are the weakest, and I'm going to intentionally choose to die for you. No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord. Instead of the strong eat the weak, instead of this being a dog eat dog world, the strong will die for the weak. The leaders will serve those that they rule. Instead of villainy winning the day, heroism, nobility is something to pursue. Is something to pursue. All right? But let's look at some of these examples, right? Celsus, a guy named Celsus, Christianity's most persistent critic, actually presents the involvement of women as a cause for derision. This is the quote from this ancient man, Celsus. Christians show that they want and are able to convince only the foolish, dishonorable, and stupid, only slaves, women, and children. Here, Celsus engages in a standard polemic against Christianity. Polemic, by the way, it just means it's the opposite of apologetic, right? An apologetic is a defense for a worldview. A polemic is an attack on a worldview. So Celsus engages in a standard attack against Christianity, presenting it as something that lacks the Greco-Roman ideals of masculinity and is primarily a religion for women and children. Celsus continues his ridicule by accusing Christians of hiding out in their private houses and unwilling to engage in the public sphere. Yet another way to associate Christianity with women who are often the managers of those households. He does the same thing again elsewhere when he says that Christian women took children to the wool dresser's shop, or the cobbler's, or the washerwoman's shop that they might learn perfection. He's mocking us. Celsus is probably referring to the way that women catechized or instructed children in homes or private businesses. The early Christian movement is domestic and, ran by women, with the exception of the eldership and the apostles, right? Pliny the Younger writes to Emperor Trajan the fact that he's writing about Christians, but he mentions specifically two female slaves, a less than veiled statement that Christianity is an emasculated religion, even if some men happen to participate. Right? Pliny had complained that this new religious movement has affected both sexes, men and women. Right? Lucian, right? Virulent critic of early Christianity, comments about the quote widows and orphan children unquote who were gullible enough to bring meals to the charlatan Peregrinus while he was in prison. Right? Wild stuff, man. Last example from this particular article author. Early 3rd century, a guy, Minucius Felix, penned an apologetic work called Octavius, which contains a dialogue between a pagan named Caecilius and a Christian named Octavius. Caecilius, the not Christian guy who's arguing against Christianity in the book, offers a lengthy diatribe against Christianity, including the criticism that early Christianity was recruiting from the dregs of the populace, quote, the dregs of the populace, incredulous women with the inability natural to their sex, unquote. So what do we make of the fact that early Christianity was mocked for being pro-women? Well, it certainly turns the tables on the overused criticism in the modern world that early Christianity was a patriarchal, misogynistic religion that was hostile to women. And while that claim is repeated over and over, it's hard to sustain in the context of the ancient world. It seems more true of the non-Christian Greco-Roman elites. So, if early Christianity was a bad place for women, then apparently all the women who joined the movement never got the memo. Come on, man. Come on, man. It's what we do. It's what we do. And this right here, right? This sexual ethic, this ethic about marriage, right? And holding men to this standard of no, one woman for life, right? One woman for life, no divorce unless she's unfaithful. right? I mean, there's two other reasons you can too, but it's very unlikely that a woman would do the other two reasons. So, you know, unless she cheats. No, that's who you got. That's who you got, right? That's the kind of ethic that brings a lot of security to women, right? Because women want strong men. Women want men to be strong the way that Jesus commands men to be strong. And true femininity finds safety for its best, most beautiful expression under the banner of Jesus defined strong masculinity. Just is what it is, right? That's also why, eldership is exclusive to men. Men, you got to lead. That's what you do. And men, when you lead well, the women will have the space to be women well, right? Because they don't have to split their time between trying to be a woman and trying to be a man, and trying to do the things that men ought to be doing in society, in the home, right? Come on, man. Come on, man. Women in the early first, second, third century saw it, flocked to it, right? Come on, man. You got to step up. And Jesus stands 10 toes down on this, right? When the disciples complain, he politely but firmly says, "You don't like it? Tough." Right? Jesus lays out the two options for the Christian male. Either you get married and be faithful in that marriage, loving and serving and leading your wife in the Lord, or become a eunuch for the kingdom. But Jesus has a zero tolerance policy towards diminishing marriage for the sake of your comfort and for the sake of your indulgence. Why? Because marriage is a lived out picture of the gospel. The man portrays Christ while the wife portrays the church. If you aren't committed to sketching that image faithfully, then respectfully, don't even pick up the pen. Just be a eunuch for Jesus. And he brings up eunuchs to underscore his rhetorical point that he's serious when he says, if you're not committed to doing marriage right, then be single for life and use that extra time on your hand for my kingdom. All right? Our culture that's enamored with transgender ideology, I think, makes way too much of this eunuch thing. That I think Jesus is literally only bringing it up for rhetorical punch. Um, but I delved into it at a deeper level in episode 4 of transgenderism in the gospel. Is just not what we're here for today. But if you look at what Paul wrote, because again, I people like to say all the time that Paul just hijacked the Christian religion and nothing that Paul ever said was in the mouth of Jesus. So I like showing these areas of overlap where we look at what Jesus said and then we'll look at something relevant that Paul said and we'll see no, they said the same thing. They were saying the they were saying the exact same thing, right? You look at Ephesians, and you look at Ephesians, right, where Paul talks about marriage. He says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands." But look at what he says to husbands. Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Where is he getting that from? Maybe, I don't know. Maybe Paul's getting it from Mark chapter 10 when Jesus said, those that rule, those that have positions of authority in the kingdom, serve those that are under them. Maybe that's where he's getting it from. He sees Jesus take this ethic and derive it exactly from what he was about to do for his body. And so Paul just picks up on that. Yeah, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Yeah, just like he said in Mark. All right? That he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Where does Paul get this from? That husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. Where does he get it from? That the husband that loves his wife loves himself. Where does he get that from? From Genesis. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Right? And then, again, in his letter to the Corinthians in chapter 7, right? The Corinthian church was a church that tended to extremes, right? When they got something wrong, they got it extremely wrong. They very rarely were in the middle about things, just from it seems in their letter. And so when Paul says, he's kind of doing a Q&A with the Corinthian church at this point in the letter. So they had written some questions to him wanting Paul's answer, kind of YouTube-y, I guess. Paul says to that church, concerning the matters about which you wrote, and then he quotes them. They were saying that it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, right? And it's true. It's just that they took it too far, right? It is a good thing for a man to have self-control, but don't take that too far. Marriage is good too, right? Because we see that in Christian history as well, right? The Catholic priesthood or portions of the Catholic priesthood, saying, men can't be married to do this. We've got, monks, in later centuries that, said, ixnay on marriage, kind of like this portion of the Corinthian church was saying, well, it would be good for a man to not have sexual relations with a woman at all. Well, Jesus didn't actually teach that. And that's what Paul's about to say. Marriage is good too because it answers that not just temptation, but that biological drive within us with a godly alternative to giving into temptation. Right? Because that's what Paul says. Because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Right? God's answer to your temptation to have some sex with a bunch of people is to have a bunch of sex with one person. All right? And this is where I got to say, hear me. All right? All right? People. Hear me. Okay? You have urges, you have drives, you have hungers in the sexual dimension of who you are, because most humans, at least, are inherently sexual beings. I would say all of us are, but I digress. The provision for that drive, for those good drives, the provision for that is within marriage. What did God give you for that? He gave you marriage. Go find an opposite sex human who follows Jesus, enter into the gospel based marriage covenant. And by the way, that should be easy for the people of the gospel. Hello. And then have all the sex you need while not violating higher virtues, of course. Right? And let me pull this back up again. I wanted to make sure you guys was paying attention to me, all right? But notice the language of mutual ownership that Paul uses throughout these verses. Each spouse loses authority over their own body, but gains authority over the body of the partner in the domain of sexual need. If the husband is hungry sexually, the wife has a duty to put out. If the wife is hungry sexually, the husband has a duty to put out, without compromising higher virtues, obviously. this is big encouragement from Paul to not ignore these hungers and deprive each other needlessly. He says, even if you guys do deprive one another sexually for a limited time so that you guys can devote yourselves to prayer about something, even if you guys do something like that, when that time of focused prayer is over, come together again. And that come together in this sexually, come together sexually again, so that Satan doesn't have an easy route to tempt you into being unfaithful because of your lack of self-control from being a human, bro. Right? I'm gonna say it loud, I'm gonna say it proud. Don't become a victim of purity culture. You know what I mean? Not the purity culture that says save yourself for marriage. I'm talking about the purity culture that unreasonably extends the season of singleness by hyper spiritualizing the search for a spouse. But that is another episode entirely. All right? Let's keep going with some of what Paul says here, right? Here verses 10 to 12, to the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. So Paul is saying what he's about to say right here isn't from him, it's from Jesus. And what does he say? The wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. Come on, man. That's exactly what Jesus was saying here in Matthew 19, right? They're no longer two but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. That's exactly what Paul said, right? They should stay together, right? And if you do separate, don't marry another. Be reconciled to your husband. Work it out. Figure it out. Get some grace into the mix, right? And then we see in verses 12 to 16, Paul's going to do something very interesting, right? Let me read it first and then we'll see what he's doing. To the rest I say, in parentheses, I, not the Lord. So Paul's making clear that what he's about to say here is not him just quoting from Jesus. This is a Paul original, you might say. And people sometimes get a little bit confuzzled by, well, why is Paul doing that? Why is Paul giving does he have what gives him the right to do that? Well, we'll get into that, but let's look at what he says first. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they're holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? All right. Verses 12 to 16, this section here is Paul exercising his authority as an apostle to bind and loose concerning doctrinal matters. We talked about that in an earlier episode in this playlist. All right, I won't go into all of it, but suffice to say, when Jesus gives Peter and the other apostles, what you bind and what you loose is bound and loosed, right? That's not a spiritual warfare thing. That's a doctrinal matters thing. Binding and loosing. Hebrew phrase amongst the Pharisees and amongst the teachers, right? For, making declarations about what the law allows and what it doesn't allow, right? So what we were reading in the Talmud a little earlier, that discussion between Shammai, Hillel, and Akiva, between those three rabbis, that's a binding and loosing discussion. What about divorce is bound? What about divorce is forbidden to us? And what about divorce is freed to us? What are we allowed to divorce for? And what are we not allowed to divorce for? Right? Apostles have this authority, right? The 12 definitely have this authority. And Paul, as apostle to the Gentiles, has this authority. And yes, it's perfectly fine recognized by the Apostle Peter himself, actually. In 2 Peter chapter 3, the Apostle Peter says, "Count the patience of our Lord as salvation, just as our beloved brother Paul also wrote to you according to the wisdom given him, as he does in all his letters when he speaks in them of these matters. There are some things in them that are hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable twist to their own destruction, as they do the other scriptures." Right? So the Apostle Peter greenlights Paul to be able to do that. Yeah, it's okay. Paul can do this. Paul has the authority to say, "I, not the Lord." He's an apostle. We recognize it. It's fine. Right? That's why Paul clarifies, "I, not the Lord." Right? He does it not just there, but he does it in verse 25. Now concerning the betrothed, right, the engaged, the virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. And again, he'll make that caveat in verse 35. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. Right? Paul is doing something that is a very common Pharisaical thing to do, and that is to make a case law ruling. A case law ruling. See again what I mean by case law, right? If any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, that's an undesirable scenario, and she consents to live with him, right? In this scenario, don't divorce. Don't divorce, right? If the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. Right? If you were an unbeliever married to another unbeliever, at some point during the marriage you get saved and spouse wants to bounce because they don't like the new Christian you, let them go, says Paul. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. Why does Paul say this? Why does Paul say let him go? How do you know whether you're actually going to save him? How do you know? Like, you don't know that, right? Because so often, believers want to make marriages with unbelievers work on the basis of they might get saved, right? And maybe so, right? If they consent to live with you, if they still want to stay with you, then yes, go for it. Be missional. But if they want a divorce specifically because of your Christian witness, Paul says let them go. Let them go. Don't fight for it. Because just as much as you might be the one to save them and lead them to Christ, you also don't know that. It's a little bit arrogant and, putting way too much weight on yourself and not nearly enough weight and trust in God to think of yourself as the linchpin, as the crux of your unbelieving spouse's salvation in the event that they want to leave you specifically because you're a Christian. Right? And then one last time at the end, Paul says something similar. Verse 39, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. In other words, she can marry who she wants. Got to be a Christian, though. Yet, in my judgment, says Paul, she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. Right? So he's doing what Pharisees do, right? Make a case law ruling. In the case of some situation that is already less than ideal, how do we keep the worst case scenarios from happening? Paul is doing a very Jewish thing here in 1 Corinthians 7 when he says, I, not the Lord. And his previous life as a Pharisee has trained him to do this sort of thing properly. But now that he serves Jesus, he can actually be a Pharisee the proper way for the benefit of Messiah's people. And that is an awesome, awesome thing. All right. So we'll do the next half of Matthew 19. We'll do the next half of Matthew 19 next time. Look at the story of the rich young ruler. And all that there is to mine from that. But for now, quick little recap as we come to the end. All right. Singleness, or being a kingdom eunuch, is a valid option for the believer. And that option has real advantages and challenges, just like being married has real advantages and challenges, right? Just understand that, sexual looseness, not a thing Jesus is cool with. Like I said, the reason for this is because of Jesus's insistence that marriage be honored as holy and sex be regarded as sacred, because it involves human bodies, which are themselves sacred to the Lord. The Christian distinctive calls men to a higher level of honor and nobility and a deeper commitment to God and our wives. Divorce is always a departure from God's ideal, sinful when done for our own convenience, but sometimes it is the best case scenario left on the table to preserve what is still good. In other words, in cases of cheating, abuse, or abandonment. If you want the full details on that, I'm going to put the episode for that in the suggested. It's going to be called Herod's Hubris. Herod's Hubris. All right, I'll put it at the end you can look for it. And lastly, singleness is not a lesser option to marriage that is reserved for lesser Christians. It's just a different option. And we as the church need to do a much better job in teaching and encouraging this truth. Okay? Like I said, that's all I've got for you. Go check out some of those other episodes that I've mentioned so far. And like I said, big props to you guys for for you guys that listen regularly, for telling the algorithm this is something worth listening to and sharing to others. I would ask that you do the same. Share this on your social media platforms. Share specific episodes of people that you think would benefit from it. And until next time, this has been the Foreign Saints podcast. I'm Saint K. And until next time, people, go in peace.